In 1945, the United States government made a decision that was never fully explained, not to the public, not to the country, not even to history. They took the scientists who built the weapons of the Third Reich, men who used slave labor, men whose rockets killed thousands, and instead of putting them on trial, they gave them new identities, new lives. They erased their crimes from official records and brought them to the United States. This was not a mistake. This was not an accident. This was a classified operation, approved at the highest levels of government. It had a name: Operation Paperclip. And what it reveals about the decisions made after World War II is one of the darkest chapters in American history. This story is built entirely from declassified documents. Documents the government tried to hide for decades. To understand Operation Paperclip, you have to understand the world of 1945. Germany had just surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But another war was already beginning. A silent one, between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both sides knew the next war wouldn't be fought with soldiers. It would be fought with technology, rockets, biological weapons, chemical agents, advanced aircraft. Whoever controlled these would control the future. And there was one problem. The people who knew how to build them were all in Germany. Nazi scientists, men who had already developed these weapons for Hitler. Suddenly, they became the most valuable assets on Earth, and the race to find them started immediately, before the war was even truly over, before the bodies had been buried. This operation wasn't public. It was not approved by Congress, and it was never meant to be known. But the decisions made in those weeks would shape the next 50 years of American power. The scientists American intelligence was hunting were not ordinary researchers. These were the men who built the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile in history, a weapon that rained down on cities, killing thousands of civilians. London, Antwerp. No warning, no defense, just impact. But that was only the beginning. These same men had developed chemical agents, so powerful, a single drop on exposed skin could kill within minutes. And then, there were the experiments, medical experiments, conducted on prisoners, inside concentration camps, experiments so brutal that the doctors who performed them were later put on trial, charged with crimes against humanity. This is who they were, and these were the men the United States government decided it needed. At the highest levels, a decision was made that their knowledge, their expertise, their value mattered more than the crimes they had committed. The operation began. Immediately after Germany surrendered, American intelligence teams were sent into the ruins of the Reich. They had one mission: find the scientists before the Soviets did. They moved fast, through destroyed cities, through abandoned laboratories, through universities, and hidden research facilities. Every location was pulled from captured documents, interrogations, fragments of a collapsing regime. And what they found was far worse than expected. Underground factories, where V-2 rockets had been built by concentration camp prisoners. Men who died by the thousands, from exhaustion, from starvation, from execution. Then came the laboratories, where chemical agents were created, tested, on human subjects. And beyond that, research centers, developing technology, years ahead of the rest of the world. It was all there, hidden, waiting. And the Americans took everything they could. Every document, every design, every scientist, before the Soviets could get there first. At the center of this operation was one man, a military intelligence officer. His name was Bosque Webb. He became the architect of America's plan. The man who argued that these scientists should not be punished, but protected. He pushed this idea inside the highest levels of government, forcefully, relentlessly. And in internal communications, he used a phrase that would later become infamous. He described concerns about the Nazi past of these men as a picayune objection, a trivial complaint, something not worth considering. Think about what that meant. These were men who had worked for Hitler, who had used slave labor, who had been part of a system responsible for mass death. And yet, in his view, none of that mattered. Not compared to what they knew. Not compared to what they could build for America. And in the end, that argument won. The past was erased. The program moved forward. There was one major problem, a legal one. At the time, American law was clear. Anyone connected to the Nazi Party wasn't allowed to enter the United States. No exceptions. And yet, the scientists American intelligence wanted were almost all Nazis. Many were party members. Some had been part of the SS, the same organization that ran the concentration camps. By law, these men should have been denied entry, immediately. No debate, no discussion. But instead, a different decision was made. Behind closed doors. The records were changed, files were rewritten, histories were altered. Nazi affiliations were removed or simply erased. They were no longer listed as members of the regime. They became stateless persons, new identities, clean records, and before any legal process could catch up, they were given clearance, approved, and quietly brought into the country. Not through normal channels, not through official review, but through a system designed to bypass the law itself. The most important scientist, brought to America under Operation Paperclip, had a name. Wernher von Braun. He was not just another engineer, he was the technical director of the V-2 rocket program, the weapon that had already killed thousands. He had been a member of the Nazi Party. Since 1937, he held the rank of major in the SS, and he had personally visited the underground factory at Mittelwerk, where VI-2 rockets were built by concentration camp prisoners, men forced to work until they collapsed, until they died, thousands of them. Von Braun saw it. He knew exactly what was happening, and he did nothing. When the war ended, he surrendered to American forces, not empty-handed. He brought 14 tons of technical documents, designs, plans, knowledge, everything they needed. He was processed, given a new identity, and brought to the United States. And in the years that followed, Wernher von Braun became a hero, the man who helped build the Saturn V rocket, the rocket that took Americans to the moon. The same man, the same past, just a different story. Transforming Wernher von Braun into an American hero required something else. Not science, not engineering, but rewriting his past. The version of his story presented to the public was carefully constructed. His SS rank was gone. His Nazi Party membership erased. His visits to Mittelwerk never mentioned. The prisoners who died building his rockets did not exist. It was as if none of it had ever happened. And when journalists asked questions, von Braun was ready. His answers were precise, controlled. He spoke as a scientist, a man of progress, a man of the future. Never, a man of the regime, and the government supported it, because the truth was inconvenient, because von Braun was too valuable. His knowledge was essential to rockets, to missiles, to the future of American power. And so, the real story was classified, locked away, hidden from the public for decades. Werner von Braun was not the only one. He was just the most visible. Behind him, there were hundreds more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, technicians, all brought into the United States under Operation Paperclip and related programs. They came from everywhere: rocket programs, aviation research, chemical weapons, biological weapons, medical experiments. Some of them had worked directly inside concentration camps, and every single one went through the same process. Their past was reviewed, their value was measured, and if their history was a problem, it was changed. Files rewritten, details removed, records adjusted, until they were acceptable. Then they were placed inside American universities, government laboratories, military research facilities, and there they continued their work, the same knowledge, the same skills, in some cases, the same methods. Only one thing had changed: the country they were now working for. There was something else the public didn't know. Even inside the government, the truth was hidden. The State Department wasn't told everything. The Department of Justice was kept in the dark. The files that passed through them looked clean, because they had been cleaned, sanitized by military intelligence. Anything that could trigger questions was removed. Anything that could stop the process was erased. And for a time, it worked. Senior officials later said they had been misled, deliberately. They were approving entries without knowing who these men really were. A few people raised concerns, quietly. They questioned the past. They questioned the risks. But those concerns were overruled, dismissed, irrelevant, because the decision had already been made. At the highest level, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of War, Operation Paperclip was a priority. Above the law, above ethics, above everything. And so the scientists entered the country, and the records that told the real story were locked away, hidden, where no one was supposed to find them. Among the men brought to America were not just scientists. They were individuals directly connected to some of the darkest crimes of the Nazi regime. One of them was Kurt Blome, a senior figure in Nazi biological weapons research, a man linked to experiments on concentration camp prisoners. He stood trial at Nuremberg and walked free. Soon after, he was recruited by the United States. Then there was Walter Schreiber, head of medical science for the German military, a man who had coordinated human experimentation. He was brought to America, given a position inside the Air Force, until a journalist exposed who he really was. And then he disappeared, quietly relocated to Argentina, with assistance from American intelligence. And then Hubertus Strughold, a name later celebrated, the father of space medicine. His research helped shape America's future in space. But part of that knowledge came from experiments conducted on prisoners at Dachau. These were not isolated cases. These were the men who were brought in, protected, and put to work. The people who survived knew exactly who these men were. They recognized the names, the faces, the histories. They had lived through it. And when information about Operation Paperclip began to surface. They spoke out, loudly. Organizations representing Holocaust survivors protested. They demanded answers. They demanded accountability. They said the United States was rewarding men who had helped carry out mass murder. They said the promise of justice, made at Nuremberg, was being broken, in secret, by the same government that had prosecuted the trials. They argued no strategic advantage, no future technology could ever justify this, could ever justify giving these men safe lives, comfortable homes, new identities, after what they had done. But the protests changed nothing. They were ignored. The official response was denial. No war criminals had been admitted. That was the claim. At the same time, the documents that proved otherwise were classified, hidden, locked away, and so the survivors were left with their memories, while the men responsible built new lives, careers, families in American suburbs. The results were undeniable. The knowledge brought to America changed everything. The rocket technology, developed by von Braun and his team, became the foundation for ballistic missiles, for nuclear delivery systems, for the American space program, the rockets that would later reach orbit and carry humans to the moon. That knowledge came from them. The same was true for chemical weapons. Research developed in Nazi Germany was absorbed, expanded, used by the United States. Aviation technology advanced faster. Aircraft became more capable, more powerful, more precise. Even medical research played a role. Data, findings, results, some of it obtained through human experimentation. All of it fed into American military and aerospace medicine. The United States got exactly what it wanted. The scientists delivered. The technology advanced. The future was secured. But there was a cost. A cost that was never fully acknowledged. A moral compromise that has never been fully reckoned with. The United States was not alone. The Soviet Union was doing the same thing. Their operation had a name, Osoaviakim, but their method was very different. In October 1946, Soviet forces moved in at the same time across multiple locations. Thousands of German scientists were taken, arrested, along with their families. No negotiations, no offers, no choice. They were loaded onto trains, transported under armed guard into the Soviet Union, and put to work immediately inside Soviet research facilities. The contrast was clear. The Americans recruited, promised freedom, careers, citizenship. The Soviets simply took theirs. But in the end, the goal was exactly the same. Both sides understood the future of war would be built by these men, and both sides were willing to ignore the past to secure that future. The Cold War had already begun, and the scientists of the Third Reich had become prizes. For years, almost everything about Operation Paperclip remained hidden, not just from the public, but from most of the government itself. When questions started to appear, the answers were controlled, limited, carefully managed. Journalists were given fragments, never the full story, and inside the system, only a small number of officials had access to the truth. The official version was simple. A small group of scientists, clean backgrounds, brought in to help. That was the story everyone was supposed to believe. But the deeper people looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Files that didn't match, names that raised questions, histories that didn't make sense. And behind all of it, a growing suspicion that the real program was far bigger, far darker, than anyone had been told. And the truth was still buried. For decades, the truth stayed buried, until someone started digging. In 1985, a journalist named Linda Hunt began uncovering documents, not rumors, not speculation, official records, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. What she found didn't match the story. Names that should not have been there, histories that had been altered, files that had been rewritten. She documented everything, case by case, scientist by scientist. She showed how records had been changed, how pasts had been hidden, how the truth had been managed. And for the first time, the gap became visible between what the government said and what the documents proved. She published her findings, named names, exposed the system, and it could no longer be ignored. The investigation grew, the story spread, and what had been hidden for decades was finally starting to surface. But the response was controlled, carefully worded. Yes, irregularities had occurred. That was the admission. But the program was still defended. Necessary. Essential. For national security. The question that remained was never fully answered. Was it worth it? Eventually, the investigations began. Inside the Department of Justice, there was a unit focused on one task: tracking down Nazi war criminals, the Office of Special Investigations. And sooner or later, they reached Operation Paperclip. They started reviewing cases, digging through records, comparing files. And what they found confirmed the worst suspicions. Documents had been falsified, histories had been altered. Men with known involvement in war crimes had been admitted, under false pretenses. Some of them had lived in the United States for decades, holding respected positions, working inside major institutions. Long after their past was no longer a secret. The investigators tried to act. Cases were opened. Legal action was pursued. But there was a problem. Time. Too much of it had passed. Some of the men were already dead. Others had become American citizens, protected. Difficult to remove, difficult to prosecute. The system moved slowly. The evidence was complicated. And in the end, only a few cases led to consequences. Limited. Incomplete. For the survivors who had waited for justice, it never truly came. Werner von Braun died in 1977. Not in disgrace, not in silence, but celebrated, honored as one of the key figures of the American space program. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest honors in the United States. The citation spoke of achievement, of progress, of a life devoted to science, to space, to the future. But it said nothing about his past, nothing about the SS, nothing about the Nazi Party, nothing about Mittelwerk, nothing about the thousands of prisoners who had built his rockets and died doing it. That part of the story was not mentioned, not acknowledged, not remembered. At the same time, the men who suffered there received nothing. No recognition, no honor, no public acknowledgement, no apology. From the government, that had brought their tormentor into the country and given him a new life, a celebrated life. That contrast between honor and silence is at the center of this story. Werner von Braun died in 1977, not in disgrace, not in silence, but celebrated, honored as one of the key figures of the American space program. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest honors in the United States. The citation spoke of achievement, of progress, of a life devoted to science, to space, to the future. But it said nothing about his past, nothing about the SS, nothing about the Nazi Party, nothing about Mittelwerk, nothing about the thousands of prisoners who had built his rockets and died doing it. That part of the story was not mentioned, not acknowledged, not remembered. At the same time, the men who suffered there received nothing, no recognition, no honor, no public acknowledgement, no apology from the government that had brought their tormentor into the country and given him a new life, a celebrated life. That contrast between honor and silence is at the center of this story. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is complicated. The technologies that defined American power did not appear from nowhere. Ballistic missiles, the foundation of nuclear deterrence, were built on knowledge brought from Germany. Knowledge developed under the Third Reich. The Saturn V rocket that carried Americans to the moon was designed by a team led by a former SS officer, a symbol of human achievement, connected to a much darker past. The same pattern appeared again. Chemical weapons research, nerve agents, advancements that traced back to scientists who had tested those substances on human beings. And yet, none of this was part of the public story. The achievements were celebrated, the triumphs were broadcast, but the origins remained in the shadows. A connection between progress and something far more disturbing. A connection that most people were never meant to see. There was a question at the center of everything, one that never went away. Was it justified to bring these men to America, to use their knowledge, to win a war that had not yet begun? The argument was simple. If the United States didn't take them, the Soviet Union would, and whoever controlled that knowledge would control the future. That was the logic, cold, direct, strategic. But there was another side, just as clear. No advantage, no weapon, no future could justify what these men had done. No calculation could erase that. And yet, the decision was made in 1945, quietly, behind closed doors, without public debate, without accountability. The American people were never asked. They were never told. And the question, whether it was right or wrong, was never truly answered. Because the truth was never fully revealed. Operation Paperclip did not end in the 1940s. It continued, quietly, through people, through institutions, through knowledge. The scientists who were brought to America did not just work. They taught. They trained the next generation. They built programs, departments, entire systems. They wrote textbooks, set standards, defined directions. And over time, their influence spread deeper and deeper into American science, into military research, into the foundations of future innovation. The knowledge they brought did not stay separate. It merged, integrated, became part of the system itself, until it was no longer possible to see where it began and where it ended. This was not just a transfer of people, it was a transfer of an entire body of knowledge and a way of thinking, a way of working. That became embedded inside institutions, inside processes, inside the structure of American power. And even now, the full extent of that influence is not completely understood, not fully documented, not fully examined. There was something deeply disturbing about what was happening, because it wasn't just a decision, it was a contradiction. At the exact same time, in one place, American prosecutors, stood in court at Nuremberg, presenting evidence, photos, testimonies, details of medical experiments conducted on prisoners. They spoke about justice, about accountability, about crimes against humanity. But at that same moment, somewhere else, American intelligence officers were doing something very different. They were meeting with scientists, reviewing their files, evaluating their usefulness, men connected to those same experiments. And instead of preparing charges, they were preparing offers, new identities, new lives, entry into the United States. At the same time, one part of the government was promising justice, while another part was rewriting records, falsifying documents, to bring those same men in. This was not a mistake. It was not confusion. It was a decision, made at the highest level, that what these men knew was more important than what they had done. And the people who made that decision were never held accountable. The Nuremberg trials were supposed to change everything. For the first time, the world established a principle that individuals could be held responsible for crimes against humanity, even if they were following orders, even if those orders came from a government. It was presented as a turning point, a line that would never be crossed again, a promise that justice would not be optional. But within months, that principle was already being tested and quietly set aside. Because at the same time, the United States was prosecuting Nazi war criminals. It was also recruiting others, men connected to the same system, the same crimes, the same regime. On one side, courtrooms, judgments, sentences. On the other, meetings, offers, new identities. The same government, doing both. And the gap between those two realities was not small. It was vast. A difference between what was said in public and what was done in secret, when no one was supposed to see it. Over the years, the truth didn't come out all at once. It came slowly, in fragments, through documents, files that had been hidden for decades. Gradually, they were declassified, released, studied, and with every new document, the picture became sharper, more complete, more difficult to deny. The suspicions were no longer suspicions. They were facts. Records had been falsified. Histories had been altered. Men with known involvement in war crimes had been admitted. And not in secret accidents, but with approval. Senior officials had known. They had seen the evidence. They had made the decision. Even the objections inside the government had been recorded and dismissed, set aside for strategic reasons. The documents confirmed everything, but there was something they did not contain. No regret, no admission of wrongdoing, no apology, nothing for the victims, nothing for the survivors. And the official position remained the same. It had been necessary. That was the answer. It had to be done. And the alternative would have been worse. There is a question that cannot be answered. What would have happened if Operation Paperclip never existed? If the United States had refused, would the Soviet Union have moved ahead, gained control over missile technology? Would the balance of power have shifted? Would the Cold War have looked different? Would the space race have ended another way? There are no answers. History doesn't allow experiments. There is no second version, no alternate timeline, only one path. And in 1945, the people making the decisions understood that. They saw the risk, the possibility of falling behind. And they chose not to take that risk, not even for a moment, not even for principle. The decision was clear. Secure the knowledge, no matter the source, no matter the past, no matter the cost. And that decision was made quietly, without debate, without oversight, without the knowledge of the people in whose name it was made. There is another layer to this story, one that connects Operation Paperclip to what came after, because it didn't end with rockets or weapons or the Cold War. It continued in different forms, under different names. One of those programs was MK Ultra, a secret project focused on human experimentation, control, psychological manipulation. And while it was presented as something new, the methods were not entirely new. Some of the approaches, some of the ideas, traced back to research that had already existed, research developed in Nazi programs and brought to America through Operation Paperclip. The people who designed these programs worked inside institutions that had already been shaped, influenced, defined by those earlier scientists. And that creates a connection, a thread, from one system to another, from one era to the next, a line that runs quietly through history, linking experiments across decades, a connection that has never been fully acknowledged and is still not fully understood. For decades, the demands never stopped. The survivors and their families kept asking the same questions, again and again and again. They wanted the truth, all of it, every document, every file, every name. They wanted acknowledgement, a clear statement that what had been done was wrong. They wanted accountability, and they wanted an apology for what had been taken from them, for what had been ignored. Organizations representing survivors pushed for answers, publicly, relentlessly. They called for the release of every remaining classified file. They demanded recognition. They demanded justice. But the response never fully came. Some documents were released, others remained hidden. The acknowledgement they asked for was never given. The apology never came. And the official position did not change. The program was necessary. That was the answer. Its benefits justified the decision. But the survivors never accepted that, and they never stopped saying so. Operation Paperclip raises a deeper question, not just about what was done, but about who gets to decide. Because when a government acts in secret, it is making a claim about power, a claim about control. It is saying that some decisions do not belong to the public, that the people are not entitled to know, not entitled to choose, not entitled to question. It is saying that the truth is too dangerous, too complicated, too inconvenient to be shared, and that a small group can decide instead, behind closed doors, without consent, without accountability. That is what happened in 1945. The decision was made, quietly, without public knowledge, without debate, and it was justified, as necessary, as strategic, as unavoidable. Maybe that argument had weight. Maybe the threat was real. But the secrecy, the falsified records, the deception, that was something else, something separate, a second decision, and one that no justification investor can fully erase. For many of the American scientists, this truth was invisible. In the 1950s, in the 1960s, working alongside Wernher von Braun and his team, they saw colleagues, engineers, experts, people focused on the same goal, building something new, reaching further. The past was not part of that world. It had been removed, classified, erased from official records. The biographies they read said nothing, and so they accepted them, worked with them, trusted them, without knowing who they had been. It was only years later, when files began to open, when journalists started asking questions, that the truth began to surface. And when it didn't land the same way. Some were shocked, some refused to believe it, some tried to understand it, and some accepted it quietly, as part of a reality where, during the Cold War, decisions had been made that were difficult to justify. Even looking back, for the families of the scientists, life felt normal. Their children, their grandchildren, grew up as Americans with ordinary lives, ordinary memories. To them, these men were fathers, grandfathers, people they loved. The past was not part of that story. It had been hidden, removed, left behind. And for many, it stayed that way, until the truth began to surface. Years later, through documents, through investigations, through things they were never meant to see. And in that moment, everything changed. The person they knew was no longer the same. Some denied it. Some couldn't accept it. Some tried to explain it, to justify it, to make sense of it. But on the other side, there were families who never had that distance, who never had that uncertainty. They knew, from the beginning, what had been done, who had done it, what it had cost. There was no confusion, no second version, only loss and memory, and the knowledge that the men responsible were given new lives, while their own families were destroyed. Even now, the full truth is not public, not completely. There are still files that remain classified, still questions without answers, details that have never been confirmed. Historians have tried, journalists have tried, but they worked with limits, because the full picture is still locked away. And the reason has always been the same: national security. That's the answer. But what threat requires silence 80 years later? That question has never been clearly answered, officially. Operation Paperclip ended in 1990. The program was closed, the files were moved, archived, but the impact didn't end. The institutions remained, the systems remained, the knowledge stayed. The men were gone, retired, dead. But what they built continued. Their work became part of something bigger, integrated, absorbed, until it was no longer separate, no longer visible, just part of the foundation of American science, of military power. And at that point, it couldn't be undone. It couldn't be traced. It simply became part of the system. The story is known, documented, accessible, but not fully understood, not fully accepted. What happened was never truly absorbed into how the country sees itself. The falsified records, the deliberate choices, the decision to trade justice for advantage. All of it remains on the surface, a footnote, not a central chapter, not something fully confronted. The survivors got part of the truth, but not justice. And now, time has done the rest. The men are gone, the witnesses are aging, and with every year, the possibility of real accountability disappears. It didn't stop with Paperclip. The same pattern kept repeating, again and again. Decisions made in secret, without accountability, without the public, always justified the same way. National security. That was the reason. Every time, different programs, different places, same logic. What was said and what was done were not the same. And that gap never disappeared, became permanent. A difference between image and reality, between values and actions. Operation Paperclip was not an exception. It was the beginning. So what remains? Now, the people are gone. The moment has passed. But the record is still here. And the question hasn't changed. What should be done with the truth? There are answers. Simple ones. Release the files, all of them. Acknowledge what was done, clearly, without hiding. And say it, out loud. An apology. To those who were never heard. None of this changes the past. None of it threatens the present. It is not punishment. It is not revenge. It is honesty. About decisions made in secret, in the name of people who were never told. In the end, this is what the story is about. Not just Paperclip, but how decisions are made. When power decides the goal matters more than the cost, more than the promises, more than the truth. In 1945, that line was crossed, and it wasn't the last time. Different situations, different reasons, same logic. We know better. We decide. You don't need to know. Trust us. But that logic depends on one thing: trust. And trust requires honesty. It requires truth. And once that is broken, it doesn't come back easily. Because Operation Paperclip proved something simple. The people asking for trust were willing to lie. They are gone now. The scientists, their lives are over. But what they brought remains. Their work did not disappear. It became part of something larger, part of history, the rockets, the weapons, the research, all of it connected to what came before. And that means the story of American power is not separate. It is linked to decisions made in 1945, to choices that were never fully acknowledged. And without that, the story is incomplete, because you cannot understand what was built without understanding where it came from. There's a photograph, 2 men standing side by side, smiling. One of them, Wernher von Braun. The other, the president, a rocket model between them. The future, right in front of their eyes. It looks simple, clean, optimistic, a moment of progress. But the image is incomplete. It shows the future, not the past. It doesn't show where it began. It doesn't show what came before. The factories, the prisoners, the cost. None of that is in the frame. It never is. Because photographs capture what is visible, not what made it possible. The files tell one story. Clean records. No war criminals. Everything legal. Everything justified. That's what they say. But you've seen what they don't say. What was removed. What was changed. What was hidden. Records rewritten. Histories erased. Men responsible, given new lives. While the victims waited for justice and never received it. Because sometimes what is hidden matters more than what is written. And whatever was gained came with a cost. A debt that was never acknowledged, never repaid. This is redacted truth. And the next story goes even deeper. The files say one thing. The truth says another. They say the program ended. They say the men were clean. They say justice was served. But they also say that Wernher von Braun had no past. And we know that was a lie. You've seen the gap between what is said and what is hidden, between the story and the truth. The men are gone. The witnesses are gone. But the files are still here. And some of them are still locked away. Even now, after 80 years, someone is still deciding what you are allowed to know and what you are not. And that decision tells you everything about the difference between what governments say and what they do. This is redacted truth. And the truth they tried to bury is still there.